Blood stained her torn dress, though it wasn't hers. It belonged to her father, who was currently kneeling on wet asphalt, begging a man he owed $3 million. Rain pounded against the docks of Chicago's South Side as 22-year-old Charlotte Gallagher shivered, staring at the polished shoes of the city's most feared syndicate boss. She knew how men like Dominic Costello operated. They took what was owed, or they took a life. So, when her father pointed a trembling, bloodied finger at her and screamed, "Take her. She's yours. Just clear my debt," she closed her eyes, preparing for a bullet. Instead, she got something entirely different. Richard Gallagher was a man built out of cheap whiskey, broken promises, and unpaid markers. In the sprawling, unforgiving underbelly of Chicago, he was known as a loose cannon, a real estate developer whose buildings were as hollow as his credit score. But to Charlotte Gallagher, he was simply the monster who held the keys to her personal hell. Charlotte's life had been a masterclass in survival from the moment her mother passed away from ovarian cancer 10 years prior. With the buffer gone, Richard's grief curdled into a vicious gambling addiction. He didn't just play the tables. He played underground poker games, run by the outfit, bet heavily on fixed fights, and borrowed from men who settled their accounts with baseball bats and blowtorches. Whenever the debt collectors circled, Richard would take his humiliation and terror out on the only person smaller than him. Charlotte grew up learning to read the sound of his footsteps. A heavy, dragging heel meant he had lost, and she needed to lock herself in the bathroom. A fast, erratic pace meant he was high on cocaine and a winning streak, which was often more dangerous. By her 22nd birthday, Charlotte was a ghost in her own life. She worked a dead-end job as a barista in Wicker Park, handing over every crumpled dollar bill of her tips to Richard just to keep the lights on in their crumbling Lincoln Park townhouse. She had no friends. Friends asked too many questions about the bruises on her forearms or the split lips she blamed on clumsy accidents. The turning point came on a bitter Tuesday in late November. The townhouse had been foreclosed on, the electricity shut off. Charlotte was sitting in the freezing dark, wrapped in 3 blankets, when the front door splintered open. Richard was thrown into the living room, crashing over a glass coffee table. 3 men in immaculate, dark, tailored suits stepped over the threshold, bringing the freezing wind and the smell of expensive cologne with them. Charlotte froze, her breath pluming in the cold air. "You have 72 hours, Richard," the lead man said. He was an older Italian man with a scar slicing through his right eyebrow. "Mr. Costello is tired of your excuses. 3 million, or we take it out in organs." Richard, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, was blubbering, coughing up blood onto the hardwood floor. "I'll get it. I swear to God, Silvio. I have a deal closing in River North. Just tell Dominic to give me a week." Silvio didn't even blink. 72 hours. Then, "We start with your fingers." When the men left, Richard didn't apologize to Charlotte. He didn't check if she was okay. He simply dragged himself up, locked his bloodshot eyes on her, and slapped her across the face so hard she saw stars. "This is your fault," he hissed, the irrationality of a desperate addict taking full control. "If your mother hadn't drained my accounts with her hospital bills, I wouldn't be in this mess." For the next 3 days, Richard was a frantic animal caught in a snare. He made hundreds of calls, begged every contact he had ever known, and was hung up on every single time. The Chicago elite knew better than to lend money to a man in Dominic Costello's crosshairs. Dominic Costello wasn't just a mobster. At 34, he had ruthlessly modernized the Chicago syndicate after his father was indicted. He ran legitimate tech firms, high-end casinos, and shipping conglomerates. The illegal operations were buried so deep beneath layers of corporate shell companies that the FBI had spent 5 years chasing shadows. Costello was known to be calculating, icy, and entirely devoid of mercy. He didn't yell. He didn't make threats. He simply erased people. On the night the deadline expired, Richard dragged Charlotte by her hair out of her bedroom. She screamed, fighting against his grip, but he was fueled by the manic strength of absolute terror. He forced her into his rusted sedan. "Dad, stop! Where are we going?" she cried, clutching her stinging scalp. "I'm fixing it," Richard muttered, his eyes wide and unblinking as he sped through the rain-slicked streets of the city. "I'm paying my debt. I'm giving him the only asset I have left." It took a moment for the reality to crash over her. He was selling her. The sick, twisted knot in her stomach tightened until she thought she would vomit. She lunged for the door handle, but Richard had engaged the child locks. She was trapped. She stared out the window at the blurred city lights, knowing with terrifying certainty that she was not coming back from wherever they were going. The docks at Pier 39 were a desolate stretch of industrial decay, illuminated only by the harsh, flickering amber of sodium vapor streetlights. The rain was coming down in sheets, bouncing off the hoods of 3 black SUVs, parked in a semicircle, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Richard shoved Charlotte out of the car. She stumbled, her knees scraping against the wet, coarse asphalt. She was wearing only a thin, floral summer dress and a worn cardigan, entirely unsuited for the biting Chicago wind. She shivered violently, her long dark hair plastered to her face, mingling with tears she refused to let fall. Standing in the center of the headlight beams were 4 men. 3 of them were heavily armed, their hands resting casually near the holsters inside their coats. The 4th man stood slightly ahead of them, holding an umbrella. Dominic Costello. Even in the chaotic downpour, he radiated a terrifying stillness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a bespoke charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Charlotte would make in a decade. His face was sharp, aristocratic, with dark, unreadable eyes that tracked Richard's frantic approach. "You're late, Richard," Dominic said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried perfectly over the sound of the crashing waves and the pouring rain. It was smooth, deep, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I have it. I have your payment, Dominic," Richard yelled, falling to his knees. The gravel dug into his suit pants. He reached back and grabbed Charlotte by the wrist, jerking her forward so violently she cried out in pain. "Here, look at her. She's young. She's pretty. Clean. No diseases. Take her. Put her in one of your clubs. Give her to your men. I don't care. Just wipe the 3 million. We're square." A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the docks. Even the armed guards seemed to stiffen, glancing at their boss. Charlotte kept her eyes glued to the pavement. The humiliation was a physical weight crushing her chest. Her own father, her own flesh and blood, offering her up like a slab of meat to a butcher. She waited for Dominic to laugh, or to shoot them both for the insult of offering a human life for a multi-million-dollar debt. Slowly, Dominic stepped forward. The polished tips of his Oxford shoes entered Charlotte's field of vision. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable strike. "Let her go, Richard," Dominic commanded. "She's yours. I promise. She won't cause trouble. She knows how to take orders," I said. Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, a dangerous edge sliding into the smooth tone. "Let go of her wrist." Richard instantly released her. Charlotte remained on the ground, shaking, wrapping her arms around herself. Dominic looked down at her. He didn't look at her body the way the men at the underground clubs did. His eyes scanned her like a forensic investigator. He noted the fresh bruise blooming on her cheek from where Richard had hit her days ago. He saw the older, yellowing bruises on her collarbone. He saw the way she flinched when he simply adjusted his grip on his umbrella. Dominic slowly shifted his gaze back to Richard. "You value your daughter at $3 million? Yes. Yes, exactly. She'll work it off. Whatever you want her to do." Richard was nodding eagerly, a sickening smile of relief spreading across his face. He thought he had won. Dominic turned slightly towards Silvio, the scarred man from the townhouse, who was standing to his right. "Silvio, did we not appraise Richard's assets yesterday?" "We did, boss," Silvio replied gruffly. "Nothing left. Bank accounts are drained. Properties are leveraged to the hilt. And yet, Dominic mused, his dark eyes locking onto Richard. He managed to hide this. A transaction of flesh. Dominic handed his umbrella to Silvio. He stepped fully into the rain, letting the downpour soak his expensive coat. He crouched down until he was eye level with Charlotte. Up close, she could smell his cologne, something sharp, clean, like cedar and rain. "Look at me," he ordered softly. Charlotte couldn't. She was paralyzed. A large, warm hand gently cupped her chin. The touch was so unexpected, so entirely devoid of the violent force she was accustomed to, that she gasped. Dominic tilted her face up. His dark eyes searched hers, reading the decades of trauma, the terror, the absolute brokenness. He traced the line of her bruised cheekbone with his thumb, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He stood back up, towering over Richard. "I accept your payment," Dominic said. Richard let out a loud, pathetic sob of relief. "Thank you." "Oh, thank God, Dominic. Thank you. You won't regret this. She's a good..." Bang! The sound of the gunshot echoed off the shipping containers like a thunderclap. Charlotte screamed, covering her ears. Richard collapsed onto his side, howling in agony, clutching his right knee. Blood rapidly pooled around his leg, washing away in the rain. Dominic stood over him, a suppressed pistol smoking in his right hand. His expression hadn't changed. He looked as though he had simply swatted a fly. "The debt is cleared, Richard," Dominic said coldly, staring down at the writhing man. "But if you ever speak her name again, if you ever come within 50 miles of her, or if I ever find out you've drawn breath in the same zip code as this girl, I will not aim for your knee. Do you understand me? Milek." "You shot my leg!" Richard screamed. Dominic pointed the gun at Richard's other knee. "I asked if you understood me." Yes, I understand." Dominic holstered the weapon inside his coat. He turned his back on the pathetic, bleeding man and looked down at Charlotte. He offered her his hand. Charlotte stared at his open palm. He had just shot her father. He was a killer, a criminal, a monster. But as she looked from Dominic's steady hand to her father, the man who had tortured her for a decade and just sold her to save his own skin, she realized she had nothing left to lose. With trembling fingers, she reached up and placed her hand in Dominic's. His grip was firm, pulling her up effortlessly. "Silvio," Dominic called out, stripping off his heavy, warm overcoat and draping it over Charlotte's soaking wet shoulders. "Leave him. Let him crawl to a hospital. We're going home." The drive north out of the city was a silent, surreal blur. Charlotte sat in the back of the Maybach, dwarfed by Dominic's massive overcoat. It smelled like him, and the residual heat from his body offered the first true warmth she had felt in hours. Dominic sat beside her, but he didn't crowd her. He remained pressed against his own door, staring out the window at the passing highway lights, tapping a rhythm on his knee. He hadn't spoken a word to her since helping her into the car. Charlotte's mind was a chaotic storm. "What is he going to do to me?" she thought, her nails digging into the leather seats. "Is he taking me to a brothel? A safe house? Will he lock me in a basement?" She knew the stories of women who crossed the Mafia. They vanished. They were passed around as currency. Her father had sold her as a slave, and Dominic had accepted the terms. The gunshot playing on a loop in her head was a stark reminder of exactly how dangerous the man sitting 2 feet away from her truly was. After 40 minutes, the car turned off the main highway and wound its way through the dense, heavily wooded roads of Lake Forest. They pulled up to massive, wrought iron gates that swung open silently at their approach. The driveway was lined with old-growth oak trees, leading up to a staggering, modern fortress of glass, black steel, and stone. The car stopped. A guard in a suit immediately opened Charlotte's door. She hesitated, her legs feeling like lead. Dominic stepped out from his side and walked around to her. "Come," he said, his tone authoritative but not aggressive. She stepped out, clutching the coat tightly around her. Dominic led her through the massive double doors into a foyer that belonged in an architectural magazine. Vaulted ceilings, a sweeping glass staircase, and minimalist, high-end art. It was spotless. Sterile. Greta, Dominic called out. A stately, older woman in a crisp uniform appeared from a side hallway. Yes, Mr. Costello, prepare the East Wing suite, run a hot bath. Find her some clothes from the guest reserves. Dominic turned his dark gaze back to Charlotte. And call Dr. Pendleton. Tell him to get here immediately. Charlotte's heart seized. A doctor? Why does he need a doctor? Is he going to drug me? Please, she whispered, her voice raspy and broken from the cold and the fear. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. Please. What are you going to do to me? Dominic paused. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the stark terror in her wide, doe-like eyes. He saw a girl who expected the absolute worst from the world, because the world had never given her anything else. He took a single step closer, giving her ample space. I am going to have my housekeeper give you a hot bath, so you don't catch pneumonia. I'm going to have my private physician look at the injuries your father inflicted upon you. And then I am going to let you sleep in a locked room where absolutely no one will touch you. Charlotte blinked, her brain misfiring, unable to process the words. But, my father, he sold me to you, to clear the debt. I'm your payment. Dominic's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked in his cheek. Your father is a parasite. He owed me $3 million, and I collected. What he thought he was selling and what I chose to acquire are two entirely different things. I don't understand, she breathed. You don't have to understand tonight, Dominic said, his voice softening just a fraction. Tonight, you just have to survive. Go with Greta. Charlotte followed the housekeeper up the sweeping staircase, glancing back once. Dominic was standing in the center of the foyer, pulling his phone from his pocket, his face already set back into that cold, unreadable mask. The East Wing suite was larger than her entire townhouse. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a massive king-size bed draped in Egyptian cotton, and a bathroom entirely lined in marble. Greta was gentle, running a steaming bath infused with lavender oils. She provided Charlotte with a thick, plush robe and soft pajamas, then left her alone. Charlotte locked the bathroom door, surprised that it even had a lock, and stripped off her wet, ruined clothes. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the haunted, bruised girl staring back at her. She lowered herself into the hot water, letting it scald her skin, washing away the dirt, the rain, and the blood from the docks. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't have to listen for her father's footsteps. 30 minutes later, there was a soft knock on the bedroom door. Charlotte emerged, wrapped tightly in the robe. An older gentleman with a kind face and a medical bag stood in the doorway, accompanied by Greta. Miss Gallagher, I'm Dr. Pendleton. Mr. Costello asked me to take a look at you. Charlotte nodded cautiously, sitting on the edge of the massive bed. Dr. Pendleton was entirely professional. He checked her vitals, shined a light in her eyes to check for a concussion, and carefully examined the bruising on her face, arms, and ribs. These ribs are heavily bruised, but not broken, the doctor noted gently, applying a cooling salve to her side. The facial contusion will heal with ice. You're malnourished, under extreme stress, and suffering from mild hypothermia. I'm going to leave some vitamins, a mild sedative, to help you sleep, and a muscle relaxant. Did he? Charlotte hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. Did Mr. Costello tell you why I'm here? Dr. Pendleton smiled sadly. Mr. Costello tells me very little, my dear. He only told me that if I didn't treat you with the utmost care, he would throw me into the lake. I've known Dominic a long time. He is a man of severe violence, yes, but he does not harm innocents. The doctor packed up his bag, left the medication on the nightstand, and bowed out. Greta brought in a tray of hot soup and tea, placing it on a small table before leaving as well. Charlotte sat alone in the deafening silence of the massive bedroom. She ate the soup mechanically, her mind racing. She was in the belly of the beast. The most dangerous mafia boss in the Midwest owned her. Yet, she had a locked door, medical care, and food. It was a psychological game, she decided. He was lulling her into a false sense of security. Men like Dominic Costello didn't do charity. He wanted something. She just didn't know what it was yet. Around midnight, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion deep in her bones, Charlotte crept out of bed. She padded silently barefoot across the thick carpet and pressed her ear to the heavy oak door. Silence. She turned the lock with a soft click and opened the door an inch. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair at the end of the long, dimly lit hallway was Silvio. The heavily scarred enforcer was reading a paperback novel, a customized assault rifle resting casually across his lap. He wasn't looking at her door. He was facing the stairs, guarding the only access point to the east wing. He wasn't keeping her in. He was keeping the world out. Charlotte softly closed the door, engaged the lock again, and slid down with her back against the wood, pulling her knees to her chest. In the house of a killer, for the first time in her life, she felt a terrifying, confusing spark of safety. What she didn't know was that downstairs, in his dark mahogany office, Dominic Costello was pouring himself a glass of scotch and making a phone call that would alter the course of both their lives, setting into motion a sequence of events that would shock the entire Chicago underworld. Sunlight bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the East Wing suite woke Charlotte. For a fleeting second, she thought she was back in her freezing Lincoln Park bedroom, expecting the aggressive rattle of the doorknob and her father's drunken slurring. But the Egyptian cotton sheets, the ambient warmth of the climate-controlled room, and the faint scent of lavender quickly grounded her reality. She was in the fortress of Dominic Costello. She sat up, wincing as her bruised ribs protested. On the mahogany nightstand, a fresh set of clothes had been laid out. A tailored cashmere sweater, dark designer denim, and soft leather loafers. They were in her exact size. Next to them was an unbranded matte black secure smartphone and a handwritten note on heavy cardstock. My office. Downstairs. End of the West Hall. 10:00 a.m. D.C. Charlotte glanced at the gold Cartier clock on the wall. It was 9:45 a.m. After a quick, agonizing shower that stung her fading cuts, she dressed and navigated the silent, labyrinthine corridors of the estate. The house felt less like a home, and more like a high-tech command center, draped in luxury. Armed men in bespoke suits patrolled the perimeter outside, visible through the reinforced glass, but the interior was unnervingly quiet. She found the heavy double doors of the office open. Dominic sat behind a massive slab of live-edge walnut that served as his desk. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms corded with muscle and faint, jagged scars. He was staring intensely at a bank of 4 computer monitors, typing with a rapid, practiced precision. A half-empty glass of black coffee sat next to a dossier. Close the doors and sit, he commanded, not looking up from the screens. Charlotte did as she was told, the heavy doors clicking shut with a sound like a vault ceiling. She took a seat in one of the leather armchairs opposite him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt like a specimen under glass. Dominic finally stopped typing. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, and fixed his dark, impenetrable gaze on her. In the stark daylight, he looked even more intimidating. There were dark circles under his eyes, hinting that he hadn't slept at all. Doctor, Pendleton sent me your medical report, Dominic began, his voice a low, smooth baritone. Malnutrition, multiple contusions, evidence of long-term physical abuse, and severe psychological stress. Your father was thorough in his negligence. Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. Why do you care? I'm just a payment to you. Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. He opened the manila dossier on his desk and slid it across the walnut surface toward her. "Open it." With trembling fingers, Charlotte flipped the cover. Inside were birth certificates, old black and white photographs, and a ledger with faded ink. She recognized the woman in the first photo immediately. It was her mother, Catherine, standing next to a stern-looking older man in a 1970s pinstripe suit. "That is your maternal grandfather, Arthur Penhaligon," Dominic stated, watching her reaction closely. "He wasn't just a florist in the West Loop, as your mother likely told you. He was the chief bookkeeper for the Costello family during my grandfather's reign. 40 years ago, a rival outfit tried to take out my grandfather. Arthur took a bullet meant for him and smuggled my father out of the city to safety." Charlotte stared at him, her mind spinning. "My grandfather was in the mob?" "He was an associate, a loyal one," Dominic corrected. "In my world, Charlotte, blood debts are eternal. My family owed the Penhaligon line a life. When my father took over, he lost track of your mother because she married Richard Gallagher, a man so insignificant and pathetic he didn't even register on our radar. It wasn't until Richard crossed my desk 3 months ago for his gambling debts that my men ran a background check and found out who his wife was." Dominic stood up, walking slowly around the desk. "I didn't bring you here to be a slave, Charlotte. I didn't take you as a concubine or a hostage. I brought you here because the Irish faction, specifically Declan O'Bannon, are moving in on Richard's debts. If O'Bannon found out Richard had a daughter, he would have taken you to force Richard to hand over the River North real estate deeds. O'Bannon's men do not have my restraint." He stopped beside her chair, looking down at her. "I bought your father's debt to legally own his assets. And when he offered you to me at Pier 39, it gave me the absolute, undisputed right in the eyes of the syndicate to take you from him. I saved you, Charlotte. I am balancing the ledger my family owes yours." Charlotte felt the air leave her lungs. The sheer magnitude of the revelation crushed her. Her father's abuse, the poverty, the constant terror, it was all a backdrop to a decades-old Mafia blood oath she knew nothing about. "So, what happens now?" she whispered, looking up at him. "Am I a prisoner here?" "You are under my protection," Dominic replied smoothly, "which means you cannot leave this estate without my men. You will be given an allowance, access to whatever you need, and you will heal. But in return, I require something from you." "Of course." There was always a catch. "What?" Dominic leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "I am transitioning the Costello family into entirely legitimate enterprises. I am closing a $2 billion merger with a European shipping conglomerate next month. They are old money, conservative aristocrats. They do not do business with unmarried gangsters." He paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the killing blow. "You are going to act as my fiancée. We will make public appearances. You will smile for the press, wear my ring, and play the part of the devoted future wife of a legitimate businessman. Once the merger is signed and the O'Bannon threat is neutralized, I will give you $5 million, a new identity, and you can disappear anywhere in the world. A fake engagement to the most dangerous man in Chicago." Charlotte, she was trading one monster for another, but at least this monster paid well and didn't hit her. "Okay," she said, her voice steadying. "I'll do it." Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. He flipped it open. Inside rested a flawless, 5-carat emerald-cut diamond ring on a platinum band. He took her left hand, his touch startlingly warm and gentle against her bruised skin, and slid the heavy ring onto her finger. "Welcome to the family, Miss Gallagher. Over the next 3 weeks." Charlotte's reality shifted into something unrecognizable. The sprawling Lake Forest estate became a gilded cage. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't starving, she wasn't freezing, and she wasn't terrified of the dark. Dominic was a ghost during the day, locked in boardrooms or meeting with heavily armed men in the basement levels of the house. but the evenings were theirs. To prepare for their public debut, Dominic insisted they eat dinner together every night to build a credible rapport. At first, the dinners in the grand dining room were agonizingly silent. Charlotte would pick at her Michelin star quality food, hyper-aware of Dominic's penetrating gaze. But slowly, the ice began to crack. She learned that Dominic drank his scotch neat, despised small talk, and had a surprising, dry sense of humor. He learned that Charlotte loved classic literature, had a sharp wit hidden beneath her trauma, and flinched whenever a door slammed too hard. One evening, during a thunderstorm that rattled the bulletproof glass of the dining room, a sudden clap of thunder caused the estate's power to flicker and die for 3 agonizing seconds before the backup generators kicked in. In those 3 seconds of pitch blackness, Charlotte's mind violently snapped back to the night her father had dragged her out of the townhouse. The darkness, the rain, the sheer helplessness. When the lights snapped back on, Charlotte was on the floor, pressed into the corner of the room, her hands over her head, hyperventilating. A full-blown panic attack had hijacked her nervous system. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was caving in. Charlotte. Dominic's voice was close. He had crossed the massive room in an instant. He knelt in front of her, but he didn't touch her. He knew better than to grab a cornered animal. "Charlotte, look at me," he commanded, his voice devoid of its usual icy edge. It was low, grounding, and urgent. She opened her tear-filled eyes. He was crouched right in front of her, his expensive suit trousers pressed into the hardwood. "You are in my house," Dominic said slowly, holding her gaze. "The doors are locked. Silvio is outside. I am right here. No one is coming to hurt you. Breathe with me." He took a slow, exaggerated breath in, holding up his hand to pace her. Charlotte, choking on her own sobs, tried to mirror him. "In," he instructed softly. "Out. That's it. You are safe, mia cara." The Italian term of endearment slipped out so naturally it made Charlotte's heart stutter. It took 10 minutes, but slowly, the panic receded, leaving her exhausted and embarrassed. She slumped against the wall, wiping her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her cheeks burning with shame. "I'm pathetic." Dominic finally reached out. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his thumb grazing her jawline. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "You survived 10 years with a madman," Dominic said fiercely, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. "You are many things, Charlotte, but you are not pathetic. If I ever hear you speak of the woman who will wear my name like that again, I will be very displeased." He stood up and offered his hand, just like he had at Pier 39. But this time, she didn't take it out of desperation. She took it because she wanted to. While the bond inside the estate was quietly shifting from a cold transaction to something far more complicated, a storm was brewing in the city. Richard Gallagher had not crawled to a hospital and accepted his fate. Fueled by a toxic cocktail of painkillers, cheap whiskey, and a burning desire for revenge, he had limped his way to the South Side docks. He sought an audience with Declan O'Bannon, the ruthless head of the Irish syndicate. Declan was a man who enjoyed chaos. Operating out of a meatpacking plant, he listened as Richard, sweating and trembling, spilled everything. "He took my daughter," Richard spat, leaning heavily on a crutch. "Costello took her, and I know where he keeps her. I know the security blind spots of the Lake Forest estate. I built the damn HVAC system for the previous owner 10 years ago." Declan, a heavily tattooed man with dead blue eyes, smiled around his cigar. He didn't care about the daughter, but Costello having a sudden weak point, a girl he was keeping tucked away in his fortress, that was leverage. That was how you broke the unbreakable king of Chicago. "Give me the blueprints, Richard," Declan purred, "and I'll make sure you get a front row seat to Costello's funeral." The night of the Field Museum Charity Gala was supposed to be their grand debut. It was the premier social event of the Chicago elite, attended by senators, tech billionaires, and the old money aristocrats Dominic needed to impress for his European merger. Charlotte stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her suite, staring at a stranger. Greta had helped her into a breathtaking, custom-made crimson silk gown that clung to her curves and plunged elegantly in the back. Her dark hair was styled in classic Hollywood waves, and a diamond necklace, a family heirloom of the Costellos, rested against her collarbone. The bruises were completely gone. In their place stood a woman of undeniable, regal power. There was a soft knock, and Dominic entered. He stopped dead in his tracks. For a man who controlled his emotions with terrifying precision, the raw, unfiltered awe that flashed across his face was a victory. Charlotte felt deep in her chest. He was wearing a bespoke black tuxedo that fit his broad frame flawlessly. He looked dangerous, expensive, and devastatingly handsome. "You look," Dominic trailed off, stepping closer, until he was standing right behind her. He looked at their reflection in the mirror, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You look like a queen." "I look like a very expensive distraction," Charlotte corrected softly, though a blush crept up her neck. Dominic's hands gently settled on her bare waist. His touch was branding. "You are no distraction, Charlotte. Tonight, you are my equal. Walk tall, smile at the cameras, and do not leave my side for a single second." The gala was a whirlwind of flashing cameras, popping champagne, and opulent displays of wealth. Beneath the towering skeleton of Sue, the T-Rex, Dominic introduced Charlotte to the city's power players. He played the part of the smitten fiancé flawlessly. His hand was always on the small of her back. He leaned in to whisper in her ear, causing her to genuinely laugh. They were the center of gravity in the room. For a few hours, Charlotte forgot it was all a ruse. When Dominic looked at her, his eyes dark and heated, she felt a terrifying, exhilarating flutter in her stomach. She was falling for the monster who saved her. At 11:30 p.m., Dominic received a text on his secure phone. His jaw instantly clenched. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by the glacial, calculating stare of the syndicate boss. "We are leaving," he whispered into her ear, his grip on her waist tightening. "Right now. Do not run. Just walk quickly with me." Charlotte's heart spiked. "What's wrong?" Silvio just intercepted a radio frequency. "O'Bannon's men are in the perimeter." They moved swiftly toward the VIP exit near the museum's East Wing exhibits. Two of Dominic's guards, dressed in tuxedos but suddenly looking very lethal, flanked them. The corridors of the museum were dark, illuminated only by the display cases of ancient artifacts. They were 50 feet from the exit doors when the glass ceiling above them shattered. It rained deadly shards of glass as four men in tactical gear dropped onto the marble floor from the maintenance catwalks. Suppressed automatic fire immediately chewed into the marble pillars around them. "Get down!" Dominic roared, tackling Charlotte to the floor. His heavy body covered hers entirely, shielding her from the glass and the flying debris. The deafening crack, crack, crack of gunfire echoed through the cavernous halls. Dominic's guards engaged instantly, dropping two of the attackers before being pinned down behind a display case of Egyptian sarcophagi. Charlotte screamed, pressing her hands over her ears, the metallic smell of blood and cordite filling her nose. This wasn't a movie. This was real, visceral violence, and it was happening inches away. Dominic rolled off her, drawing a heavy Glock 19 from a concealed holster beneath his tuxedo jacket, in a fluid, lightning-fast motion. He didn't panic. He operated with a terrifying, lethal calm. He popped up from behind a marble pillar, fired twice, and a third attacker dropped silently to the floor with a hole in his throat. "Dominic!" Charlotte cried out as a bullet shattered the display case right above his head. "Stay on the floor." "Charlotte!" he barked, his eyes scanning the darkness for the final shooter. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the dark corridor. It was a voice from Charlotte's nightmares. "Give her up, Costello!" Charlotte froze. Her blood ran ice cold. Stepping out from behind a massive bronze statue of an elephant was Richard Gallagher. He was sweating, holding a trembling handgun, pointing it squarely at Dominic. Behind him stood the fourth tactical shooter, his rifle trained on Dominic's chest. "Richard," Dominic said, his voice a low, lethal purr. "I should have put the bullet in your skull at the docks. You ruined me!" Richard screamed, spitting as he spoke. "You took my property. O'Bannon promised me my life back if I brought him your head. And the girl. Dad, stop!" Charlotte screamed, crawling forward, her expensive dress tearing on the shattered glass. "Are you insane? They'll kill you!" "Shut up, you ungrateful bitch!" Richard snapped, aiming the gun directly at Charlotte. In that fraction of a second, the facade of the cold, untouchable Mafia boss shattered. Pure, unadulterated panic flared in Dominic's eyes. The man who had faced down entire syndicates without blinking was suddenly terrified. And it was entirely because a gun was pointed at Charlotte. "No!" Dominic roared. He didn't seek cover. He threw himself directly into the line of fire, placing his body between Charlotte and her father, raising his weapon to fire. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. The heavy thud of a body hitting the floor echoed in the silence that followed. Charlotte gasped, crawling out from behind the pillar. The tactical shooter was dead. A bullet directly between his eyes from Silvio, who had just breached the exit doors behind them. Richard Gallagher stood frozen, a blossoming red stain spreading across the center of his chest. He looked down at it in mild surprise, the gun slipping from his fingers before he collapsed backward onto the marble, his eyes staring blankly at the vaulted ceiling. Dead. Charlotte let out a choked sob, but she didn't look at her father. She looked at Dominic. Dominic was leaning heavily against a pillar, his left hand clutching his right shoulder. Blood was seeping rapidly through the crisp white fabric of his tuxedo shirt, staining the black lapel. Richard had managed to get one shot off before Dominic killed him. Dominic! Charlotte scrambled over the glass, disregarding the cuts on her knees. She reached him, her hands hovering over his bleeding shoulder, tears streaming down her face. "You're shot. Oh my God, you stepped in front of me." Dominic looked down at her. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly ebbing. He reached out with his good hand, his blood-stained fingers gently cupping her face, wiping away her tears. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, ignoring his own wound, his eyes desperately searching her body for injuries. No, I'm fine," she sobbed, pressing her hands against his chest. "Why did you do that? You could have died." Dominic's thumb stroked her cheekbone. The walls were completely gone now. The mob boss had surrendered to the man underneath. "Because my life means absolutely nothing if you aren't in it, Charlotte. The deal, the boardrooms, the syndicate, none of it matters. I am entirely, hopelessly yours." Right there, amidst the shattered glass, the dead bodies, and the screaming sirens approaching in the distance, Dominic leaned down. Charlotte kissed him back fiercely, her hands gripping his tuxedo jacket, anchoring herself to the man who had bought her life, only to give her his soul in return. The piercing wail of police sirens grew louder, bouncing off the limestone facade of the Field Museum. Inside the VIP corridor, the air was thick with the copper stench of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder. Dominic Costello, the undisputed king of the Chicago syndicate, was bleeding out on the cold marble floor, his right hand gripping Charlotte's waist with a desperate, crushing intensity. "Silvio," Dominic barked, his voice straining as the adrenaline began to crash, leaving behind blinding agony. "Secure the perimeter. We need to move." Silvio was already in motion, stepping over the corpse of Richard Gallagher with chilling indifference. "The extraction team is at the loading dock. Boss. 2 minutes." Charlotte couldn't tear her eyes away from her father's lifeless body. For 10 years, Richard Gallagher had been the monster under her bed, the architect of her suffering. Seeing him reduced to a hollow, bleeding shell should have brought a wave of euphoric relief. Instead, there was only a chilling emptiness. He had died, exactly as he had lived. A coward trying to sell his own blood for a second chance. Charlotte. Dominic ground out, his breathing shallow. He squeezed her hip, forcing her to look away from the corpse and back into his dark, pain-clouded eyes. Do not mourn him. He made his choice. I'm not mourning him, she whispered, her hands frantically pressing his ruined tuxedo jacket against the bullet wound in his shoulder to staunch the bleeding. Her crimson silk gown was soaked in his blood, the fabric heavy and wet against her knees. I'm trying to keep you from bleeding to death. Hold still. The extraction was a blur of tactical precision. Silvio and another surviving guard hoisted Dominic to his feet. Charlotte stayed glued to his left side, her arm wrapped around his waist, practically carrying half his weight as they moved swiftly through the service corridors. They burst out into the freezing Chicago night air, where two heavily armored black SUVs were idling, their engines growling low like predatory beasts. They didn't go to Northwestern Memorial or any legitimate hospital. Men like Dominic Costello did not fill out admission forms with gunshot wounds. Instead, the convoy tore through the city streets, running red lights and vanishing into the labyrinth of the West Loop. They descended into a subterranean parking garage beneath a high-end, seemingly legitimate private clinic owned entirely by the Costello family. Dr. Pendleton was already waiting in the trauma bay, his sleeves rolled up, an entire surgical team standing by. Get him on the table, Pendleton ordered, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by the sharp, authoritative bark of a combat medic. As the nurses swarmed Dominic, cutting away his blood-soaked tuxedo and beginning to pack the wound, he grabbed Charlotte's wrist. His grip was shockingly strong for a man who had lost a pint of blood. Stay, he commanded, his eyes locking onto hers, ignoring the surgical scissors snipping at his shirt. Do not leave my sight. I'm right here, she promised, her voice trembling, but resolute. She stood at the head of the operating table, her fingers weaving through his dark hair, offering the only comfort she could, while the surgical team dug the hollow-point bullet out of his clavicle. For the next 2 hours, Charlotte watched the man who was supposedly a monster endure agonizing pain without a single scream. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locked so tightly she thought it might shatter, but his eyes never left hers. In that sterile, glaringly bright trauma room, a fundamental shift occurred. Charlotte realized she was no longer a captive. She was the only thing grounding the most dangerous man in the city. Once the bullet was extracted, the wound sutured, and a heavy dose of morphine administered, Dominic was moved to a plush, secure recovery suite. Silvio stood guard outside the heavy steel door. Charlotte sat in the leather armchair beside the bed, staring at her blood-stained hands. You should wash, Dominic murmured from the bed. His voice was thick with narcotics, but his mind was still terrifyingly sharp. You look like a butcher. It's your blood, she replied quietly. She looked up at him. He was pale, his bare chest wrapped in thick white bandages, an IV line dripping fluid into his vein. How did they know? Dominic. How did my father and O'Bannon's men know exactly which exit we were taking, at exactly that time? The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. Dominic's dark eyes hardened, the drug-induced haze burning away, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Because, Dominic rasped, someone gave them the itinerary. Someone inside my inner circle. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. A mole? Only 4 men knew the exact extraction protocols for the gala. Dominic said, his jaw clenching. Silvio, Lorenzo, Matteo, and Thomas. He let out a dark, humorless chuckle that ended in a wince of pain. Declan O'Bannon just signed his own death warrant, but whoever sold me out, they are going to beg for a bullet before I am done with them. By the next morning, the Chicago underworld was vibrating with tension. The news of the shootout at the Field Museum had been scrubbed from the mainstream media, chalked up to a botched robbery by the Costello family's deep-pocketed fixers. But on the streets, The message was clear. Declan O'Bannon had taken a direct swing at the king, and he had missed. War was inevitable. Despite Dr. Pendleton's aggressive protests, Dominic was out of bed and dressed in a loose black button-down and slacks by 10:00 a.m. He converted the clinic's conference room into a war room. Charlotte refused to return to the Lake Forest estate. If there's a mole, the estate isn't safe, she had argued. Her chin tilted up defiantly when Silvio tried to escort her to a car. "I'm staying with you." Dominic had looked at her, seeing the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes, and simply nodded. The immediate problem wasn't just O'Bannon. It was Alistair Sterling, the CEO of the European shipping conglomerate. The $2 billion legitimate merger was scheduled to be signed in 48 hours. Alistair was a man of old wealth, aristocratic sensibilities, and zero tolerance for cartel-style violence. Sterling is spooked. Boss, Matteo, a young, sharp-suited lieutenant, reported, glancing nervously at Charlotte, who sat quietly at the corner of the conference table. "He's threatening to pull out. He says, doing business with you is a liability if Irish hitmen are dropping through glass ceilings." Dominic pinched the bridge of his nose, his injured shoulder stiff and aching. "If that merger falls through, the board will vote me out, and the family falls back into the dark ages of racketeering and blood feuds. Set up a meeting with Sterling. Today. Neutral ground." "He won't take the meeting, Dominic." Lorenzo, an older, heavily scarred capo, who had served Dominic's father, said grimly. "He's completely walled off in his penthouse at the Ritz. He's flying back to London tonight." Charlotte listened, her mind racing. She remembered the dossier Dominic had shown her, the meticulous planning he had poured into making his family legitimate. He had taken a bullet for her. He had shielded her from her own nightmare. Now, his empire was crumbling because of it. She stood up. The room went dead, silent. 4 lethal Mafia lieutenants turned to stare at the 22-year-old girl in borrowed clinic scrubs. "He won't meet with you," Charlotte said, her voice steady, locking eyes with Dominic. "Because you represent the violence he's running from. But he will meet with me." Dominic's eyes narrowed. "Charlotte, no, you are not stepping into this. You told me my role was to be your fiancé," she challenged, stepping closer to the table. "To be the legitimate face of your future. Alistair Sterling is an old-world aristocrat. He values family, loyalty, and poise. Let me go to the Ritz. Let me talk to him. I can convince him that the violence was an isolated incident from a desperate, indebted man, my estranged father, and not a syndicate war." Lorenzo scoffed loudly. "With all due respect, boss, we don't send women to do men's work." Dominic's glare snapped to Lorenzo with the force of a physical blow. "You speak when I tell you to speak, Lorenzo." He turned his gaze back to Charlotte, searching her face. He saw no fear, only absolute conviction. "You think you can handle a shark like Alistair Sterling?" "I survived 10 years with a rabid dog," she said coldly. "I can handle a British billionaire." 2 hours later, Charlotte, dressed in a sharp, tailored white power suit, provided by Dominic's stylists, walked into the opulent lobby of the Ritz-Carlton. She was flanked by Silvio and 2 other silent, heavily armed guards. Alistair Sterling, an elegant man in his 60s with silver hair and a bespoke tweed suit, initially refused to see her. But when Charlotte instructed Silvio to bypass the concierge and casually block the entrance to Sterling's private dining alcove, the CEO had no choice. "Miss Gallagher," Alistair said stiffly, sipping his Earl Grey tea, "or should I say, the future Mrs. Costello. Your fiancé has a rather dramatic flair for public engagements. I am not interested in doing business with a man who attracts gunfire." Charlotte sat opposite him, waving Silvio back. She folded her hands on the table, projecting an aura of absolute calm she had learned by watching Dominic. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her tone measured and sophisticated. The gunfire you refer to was not a business dispute. It was a deeply personal, tragic family matter. The man who orchestrated it was my father. Alistair paused, his teacup hovering in the air. Your father, a desperate man with heavy gambling debts to a rival faction, Charlotte lied smoothly, weaving a half-truth that sounded impeccably tragic. He attempted to kidnap me, to force Dominic's hand. Dominic stepped in front of a bullet to save my life. He didn't fire first. He protected his family. She leaned in slightly. You are looking for a partner who is ruthless in the boardroom, yet entirely fiercely loyal to his commitments. A man who will bleed to protect what is his. Dominic Costello took a bullet for a woman he intends to marry. Imagine the lengths he will go to protect a $2 billion merger with your corporation. Alistair stared at her. He saw the fire, the intelligence, and the unwavering loyalty of a woman who clearly belonged by a king's side. He slowly lowered his teacup. You are a very persuasive woman, Miss Gallagher. Alistair murmured. Tell Mr. Costello I will meet him at the Navy Pier warehouse tomorrow night at 8:00 p.m. for the signing. But if so much as a firecracker goes off, the deal is dead. Charlotte offered a polite, regal smile. There will be no fireworks, Mr. Sterling. When Charlotte returned to the clinic, Dominic was waiting in his office. When she told him Sterling had agreed to the signing, a rare, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. He crossed the room, his good arm pulling her flush against his chest, kissing her deeply, tasting of victory and desire. But the victory was short-lived. Boss, Silvio interrupted, stepping into the doorway, his face carved from stone. We found the mole. Dominic slowly released Charlotte, the warmth instantly vanishing from his eyes. Who? Silvio stepped aside. 2 guards dragged Lorenzo into the room, throwing him roughly onto his knees. The older capo's face was bruised, his lips split. Charlotte gasped, stepping back. Lorenzo, the man who had scoffed at her earlier. He's been taking payouts from O'Bannon for 6 months, Silvio reported coldly. He hated the legitimate transition. Thought you were making the family soft. He gave O'Bannon the gala itinerary, and he just sent a secure text to an Irish burner phone. Dominic walked slowly around his desk. He looked down at the man who had sat at his father's dinner table. What did you tell them? Lorenzo spat blood onto the floor, glaring up at Dominic. I told them the truth. That you're weak. That you're hiding in this clinic. And tomorrow night, you're going to Navy Pier to sign your life away to some British snob. O'Bannon is bringing 30 men to the pier tomorrow, Dominic. He's going to slaughter you. The Brit. And your little whore. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't explode. He simply drew his suppressed pistol from his waistband with his left hand. You have forgotten what it means to be a Costello, Dominic whispered. He pulled the trigger. Charlotte flinched as the muffled crack echoed in the room. Lorenzo slumped sideways, dead before he hit the floor. Dominic holstered the weapon, his face an emotionless mask. He looked at Silvio. Clean this up, and get Matteo in here. O'Bannon thinks he's walking into an ambush tomorrow night. He's right, but we're not going to be the ones caught in it. The warehouse at Navy Pier was a cavernous, empty space of exposed brick and steel beams, overlooking the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. At 7:45 p.m., a long oak table had been set up in the center, illuminated by harsh industrial lights. Alistair Sterling sat at one end, flanked by his private security. Dominic sat at the other, his arm in a black sling, looking utterly relaxed. Charlotte stood right behind his right shoulder, wearing a sleek midnight blue trench coat over a black cocktail dress. She was the queen on the chessboard, standing by her king. The contracts have been reviewed by both legal teams, Alistair said, sliding a thick leather-bound folio across the table. Sign here, Mr. Costello. And the European ports are open to your shipping lines. Legally. Exclusively. Dominic picked up the gold Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it. Suddenly, the heavy metal roll-up doors at the front of the warehouse screeched open. 4 black SUVs tore into the building, their tires squealing on the concrete. The doors burst open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. Declan O'Bannon, wielding a tactical shotgun, stepped out, followed by a dozen heavily armed men from the Irish syndicate. "Stop right there, Costello," Declan roared, racking the shotgun. "Put the pen down. The only thing you're signing tonight is your will." Alistair Sterling's guards drew their weapons, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The British CEO looked at Dominic, his face pale with fury. "You promised me no violence." "There won't be, Alistair," Dominic said calmly, not even looking up from the contract. "Just a pest control issue." Declan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Pest control? Look around you, Dominic. Lorenzo sold you out. You're boxed in. I've got snipers on the catwalks and 20 more men outside. It's over. The Chicago syndicate belongs to me now." Dominic finally looked up. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. "Did Lorenzo tell you that? Did he tell you right before he died, Declan?" Declan's smirk faltered. "What? You think a man who has run this city for 10 years doesn't know when his own dogs are biting?" Dominic said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "I let Lorenzo send that text. I wanted you here. I wanted all your top lieutenants in one room." Dominic casually clicked his pen shut. That was the signal. The lights in the warehouse instantly cut to pitch black, total, blinding darkness. Charlotte didn't panic. Silvio had briefed her thoroughly an hour ago. She closed her eyes, grabbed the back of Dominic's chair, and dropped to a crouch, pulling on the heavy, noise-cancelling earmuffs she had hidden in her trench coat pockets. High above, hidden in the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, the Costello family's elite tactical team, equipped with cutting-edge night vision goggles, opened fire. It wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. Suppressed, precision fire rained down from the rafters. In the absolute darkness, the Irish syndicate men were blind targets. They fired wildly into the air, their muzzle flashes only illuminating their own panic. The deafening roar of Declan's shotgun blasted twice, hitting nothing but concrete. It lasted exactly 45 seconds. Then, the industrial lights slammed back on. Charlotte slowly stood up, pulling off the earmuffs. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Every single one of Declan O'Bannon's men was dead on the floor. Declan himself was on his knees, his shotgun knocked away, bleeding from a gunshot wound to his thigh. He stared around in absolute horror at the slaughter of his entire command structure. Dominic hadn't even moved from his chair. He was still sitting elegantly, his pen resting on the table. Alistair Sterling and his men were frozen, untouched, staring at Dominic with a mixture of profound terror and awe. Dominic stood up slowly. He walked around the table, his polished shoes crunching on broken glass, until he stood over the kneeling, bleeding Irish boss. "You tried to take what is mine," Dominic said softly, his voice devoid of anger, entirely devoid of mercy. "You used a weak man's gambling debt to threaten my family. You tried to touch my future wife. Go to hell, Costello." Declan spat, clutching his bleeding leg. Dominic pulled his weapon with his left hand. "I own hell, Declan, and I am evicting you." He pulled the trigger. Declan O'Bannon fell backward, dead, before he hit the concrete. The war was over. The Irish syndicate had just been decapitated in under a minute. Dominic turned back to the table, smoothly holstering his weapon. He looked at Alistair Sterling, whose face was completely drained of colour. "As I was saying, Alistair," Dominic said smoothly, picking up the Mont Blanc pen, "pest control. The O'Bannon syndicate no longer exists. Your European shipping routes are entirely secure, without a single rival in the Midwest." Dominic signed his name with a flourish on the thick parchment. He slid the folio back to Alistair. The British CEO swallowed hard. He looked at the bodies, then at the man who had orchestrated their demise with the flick of a pen. He realized then that he wasn't doing business with a mere gangster. He was doing business with an apex predator. Trembling slightly, Alistair signed his name. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Costello." Alistair choked out. "Safe flight back to London," Dominic replied. Turning his back on the CEO, he walked over to Charlotte. The adrenaline, the violence, the absolute display of dominance. It should have terrified her. But as she looked at Dominic, she didn't see a monster. She saw the man who had dismantled an empire just to keep her safe. She saw her king. Dominic reached out with his good hand, his fingers tangling in her dark hair, pulling her close. It's done. You're safe. Permanently. We're safe. She corrected softly, resting her hand over his heart, feeling its steady, powerful beat. He smiled, a true, warm smile that reached his dark eyes, and kissed her fiercely amidst the smoke and the wreckage of their enemies. The evolution of Charlotte Gallagher was a masterpiece forged in trauma and baptized in the violent fires of the Chicago underworld. She had entered Dominic Costello's gilded cage as collateral, a broken, terrified girl traded for a gambling debt by a monstrous father. Yet, she did not remain a victim. Amidst the bloodlines, the betrayals, and the brutal reality of the syndicate, she found the one thing she had never known: absolute, terrifying devotion. Dominic, a king of shadows, had dismantled his own rules and waged a bloody war simply to ensure her safety. In the end, she wasn't just a bargaining chip or a fake fiancé meant to secure a legitimate empire. She was the anchor that kept the monster human, standing beside him, bearing his ring and his name. Charlotte realized that sometimes the only way to escape the demons of your past is to fall in love with the devil himself.